Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. I'd like to start this by mentioning first that I started a new channel, a new show with an old friend of mine. You can check us out at Key of Thought. I'll have a link in the description or another link in the About page, where we discuss philosophical and spiritual topics. We get into more cultural topics. We talk about music. He and I have played music for years together, and it's just more of a conversational kind of a show. We get into some of the deeper topics that I discuss here, so if you'd like to broach some of those subjects, but in a more conversational way, you might be interested in watching some episodes of Key of Thought. We do it weekly. We got a bunch of episodes in the pipeline, so every Monday morning we post, which is way more often than I've been posting here, for which I apologize. But now that I've gotten back into the swing of things, I should be posting here more often too. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Today's episode is about liminality and the Trickster. First, I guess we should go over like a definition of terms. Liminality is kind of like between places. You know, like a shoreline is a liminal place between the land and the ocean. The horizon would be a liminal place between the land and the sky. And liminality can exist, of course, in someone's personal life. Like, say you are moving from one place to another. That phase of moving would be a liminal phase. Or through rites of passage. It's a liminal phase between childhood and adulthood. Any kind of transitional phase, any betwixt and between type of thing would be a liminal state. And definition of the trickster has to do a lot with folklore and mythology. And the trickster is sort of, you can consider it a real living spiritual being, or a non-human intelligence. That's like the root of it. You have characters like Mercury and Hermes in the Roman and Greek mythology, Thoth in the Egyptian, the spider or the fox in Native American folklore. And the trickster is sometimes a devil character and sometimes a teacher character. And it generally is somewhat childlike, but is also very deadly serious. The trickster can come into your life and improve your life by teaching you and breaking you out of old habits and old norms and allowing for a transformation. And the trickster can also destroy your life if the trickster is feeling particularly precocious, or if you have a certain disposition toward certain habits or certain ways of viewing things. The trickster might take advantage of that and just try to disrupt or even destroy your life. And the trickster will appear in people's lives more often during liminal phases, during any of those transitional phases I was discussing, rites of passage, moving, excuse me, that's when the trickster shows up the most. Stable, sedentary lifestyles, well-established lifestyles and cultures will generally not have too much trickster phenomena going on. And cultures are people that are constantly on the move, constantly traveling, constantly changing in some way, will have more trickster activity occurring. If you think of liminality and the trickster, they kind of are like peanut butter and jelly. And apply it on a cultural level, you have to pay attention to, boundaries. Like liminality will have to do with boundaries and borders, and the trickster likes to cross these boundaries and borders. The trickster doesn't respect boundaries. And in fact, putting up boundaries is kind of like challenging the trickster or taunting the trickster and like inviting trouble from the trickster. So when you have a very structural civilization that has a very rigid structure, the trickster doesn't have too many ways of expressing itself, but will find a way. What Carl Jung would describe as compensation. I think I may have mentioned Carl Jung's theory on compensation in my UFO phenomenon video. And essentially, if you repress something, a psychic aspect or a spiritual aspect of yourself, it will show up anyway. And it will usually show up in some type of erratic or explosive way that is disruptive to your life. For instance, going back to the UFO phenomenon, if your spiritual habits and your spirituality is repressed and you are mostly materialistic, that inner yearning, that natural spiritual yearning that all humans have, will show up in a visceral external experience. If you get too rigid in scientific materialism and you say, oh, there's no such thing as spirits, there's no such thing as the invisible, everything's just matter, well, your spiritual part of yourself is going to be like, well, that's nonsense, because your spirit exists and it wants you to know it exists, and so it'll show up as like an alien abduction or a UFO or a flying saucer or something. It will like have real physical characteristics so that you actually experience it. Like, that's how insane compensations can be. If you don't have a healthy outlet and expression of your spirituality, it will express itself in very erratic, over-the-top, wild kinds of ways. When that happens, that's essentially the trickster allowing that to happen. Like, the trickster can be like a force of nature, like gravity or light. There's the trickster, and it will take advantage of your need to compensate. And it's like the way your psyche compensates is by calling upon the power of that trickster. It like it's a force of nature. If you want, you can call upon the power of gravity to like demolish a building. Your psyche will call upon the powers of the trickster to like produce a strange phenomenon that will be like, see, your scientific materialism can't explain this. It will like break you out of your scientific materialism or whatever rigid structures you've built up in your psyche. The trickster will help break it down. Like your psychic part of you that wants to compensate will take something from the trickster source and just sort of break your mind with something that you can't explain with whatever structures you've built up in your mind. Scientific materialism can't explain certain phenomena like poltergeists and UFOs, and that's the point. People have these experiences to break those rigid scientific structures, those scientific dogmas that are no more than a modern religion. And the trickster loves taking advantage of that sort of thing. So like the trickster is very anti-structural. This is a term that I think was coined by Victor Turner. He is an anthropologist, an excellent anthropologist, I might add. I highly recommend his book, The Ritual Process. Structure and anti-structure, it's right there in the title, that's right. He went around the world, he lived with various cultures of people, and he lived within these cultures, and he documented and experienced their rites of passage. And he showed how the cultural transformations occur in an individual during rites of passage, and how paranormal phenomena can actually occur around people who are going through this liminal phase. And so these liminal phases are anti-structural. When someone is going through a rite of passage, the culture that they're in, the community that they're in, allows them to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, while you're going through this rite of passage, you really don't need to follow our laws and customs. You can, for a limited time, a few days, a couple of weeks, whatever it is, you can experiment with sexual taboos, with thievery, with breaking the law, with narcotics, and they allow these young men going through these rites of passages to go to these taboo, fringe kind of experiences, and they let it happen, because it's like, this is just something you have to do. And this produces a type of psychic power when, sometimes these people will cross-dress. They will dress as the opposite gender. They will, instead of eating food, they will eat feces. They'll do like the opposite of what you're expected to do. They'll kind of turn cultural norms on their head. And You can see this in our own culture. We don't really have rites of passage. Our only rite of passage is, go to college and get a job. Now you're an adult. And that's not a real rite of passage. There's nothing communal about it. There's nothing spiritual about it. It's very fake. It's a very nonsensical, very shallow, unimpactful rite of passage. It's essentially meaningless and unhealthy that we don't have real rites of passage. So what happens is, teenage boys in America will become punk rockers. We'll start drinking at age 14 and we'll dye our hair and we'll take on anti-authoritarian views, anti-cultural views, adopt countercultural views. We'll flip everything on its head. We'll live outside on the streets instead of at home with our parents. We'll just do everything opposite because that is what rites of passage are supposed to allow for a limited time, to sort of get that out of your system in a way and to allow you to experience something other than the rigid structures of your society. You can experience what is against those structures and therefore become a more complete person. If you don't have a healthy ritualized way of doing this, well then you're going to have youth just turning to crime because they don't understand the impulse to want to be anti-structural. It's just something they experience viscerally. They want to be anti-structural, but they don't know why. And our society doesn't allow for it. There's no pressure release valve for it, and so it gets all pent up, and then you get horrible cultural movements out of it. You get just, people who will commit crime not in a controlled way during a rite of passage for like a week, but it will become a lifestyle for them. They'll just become thieves, or they'll commit sexual crime for the rest of their lives. They'll become serial killers. These are extreme cases, of course, but these, there's really no such thing as a serial killer except in modern Western culture. There weren't that many serial killers in more traditional civilizations that allow for rites of passage. And serial killers have a big degree of tricksterism to them. They dress up like clowns. A lot of them do eat their own feces. They cross-dress. They force their victims to cross-dress. These are all aspects of the unhealthy, the dark side of the trickster, because our culture doesn't approach this liminal stuff. Our culture is all very structural, and anything that is anti-structural is very taboo. And you're not supposed to engage in it at all. And now that has been exploited by certain groups, certain political groups, that now you have anti-structural movements coming in the modern world that are not temporary. They are touted as lifestyles, and instead of the way a shaman might cross-dress to gain spiritual power for a temporary ritual, you have like people who think they are actually the opposite gender than what they really are, and now they're in a permanently liminal phase. They might even go through certain medical procedures that will make sure it's not temporary. It will absolutely be a permanent state of liminality. Now, liminal phases can be extended or shortened depending on the goals in mind. A shaman will like to extend liminal phases as much as possible, remain in a liminal phase. So that's why they'll do weird things, taboo things, all of the time, because it allows them to gain a psychic power. Being in a liminal phase allows, because you can engage with the trickster loves liminal phases, and the trickster is kind of like a deity in a way. You can interact with the trickster more often when you're in a liminal phase. So certain shamans that like to communicate with invisible entities will use that trickster energy. So they will remain in a liminal phase. They will extend those liminal phases as much as possible by doing taboo or anti-structural behaviors, extend the liminal phase, increase their opportunity to communicate with invisible entities. People who understand that have taken advantage of our culture at large and are trying to force a permanently liminal phase in Western civilization. They want people to remain in a liminal phase through the, I don't know what you want to call them, leftist movements or cultural Marxism, or these bizarre sexual expression movements, whatever you want to view these things as. these are very liminal and anti-structural. They engage in taboos, and they engage in the worst kinds of taboos as well, the kinds that, I mean, let's just say little kids deserve better. I'm just gonna say that and leave it at that. And so they engage in all these anti-structural taboo acts, but the people engaging in them are culturally conditioned or educated in such a way that they think it's just a lifestyle choice. They don't understand the shamanic aspect, the paranormal aspect of being in a liminal phase, and how it loosens the it ungrounds you, so to speak. You know how New Agers like to talk about being grounded, and you have to balance being grounded while engaging in liminal activity. That way you have a healthy spiritual experience instead of a chaotic one. If you remain in just a liminal phase, you become ungrounded, and then you are basically the plaything of whatever non-human intelligences want to abuse your openness. They want to abuse that liminal phase you've put yourself in. They want to abuse that vortex of psychic power that you create around yourself. And if you're unaware that you're creating this open vortex of psychic power around you, then of course dark entities, unfriendly, non-human beings can then like start latching onto you, kind of like parasites and manipulators. And if you don't put the spiritual or magical protections around yourself, if you don't practice liminality in a traditional and healthy way, and you do it because you just think it's a lifestyle choice, and you're a materialist, you only believe in science and matter, you don't believe in these invisible entities, well, you are a prime cut, you are a target, you are perfect prey for these invisible entities. And so now this is happening on a large scale, on a whole political and cultural scale. And it's opening our society up to a great deal of risk. And I suspect certain people know that this is happening, and that's why they're encouraging it. They want this darkness to come in. It's a way of destroying a civilization, essentially. It's a way of undermining a culture. It's a way of undermining entire races of people, is to trick them into opening themselves up to unfriendly beings that exist out in this universe. So there are healthy ways of existing in a liminal phase, and there are unhealthy ways. And so we need to understand that the trickster exploits liminality and can come to you as a teacher and a benevolent sort of presence that will help you through a transformation, or will uproot and destroy your life just to prove to you that your views are wrong or have shortcomings. And like, the trickster doesn't really care. It has a very childlike intelligence. It plays with you. And that brings us to like poltergeists and paranormal phenomena, UFO phenomena, and how these experiences, how this phenomenon, these encounters show a childlike intelligence, They just play around with you. They do crude experiments with you. They ask you what time it is, and when you answer, they say that's wrong. Like, it's just a very bizarre experience. You read all these encounter reports with what we'd call aliens or abduction experiences, and there's a very, it doesn't care about you. It doesn't really care about your feelings or how it's gonna upset you. You look at the girls from the Portugal phenomena, the Fatima in the early 20th century, the real big mass UFO sightings, and how for months beforehand these girls were getting visitations from who they called the Virgin Mary, once every 2 weeks or something like that for a couple of months. They would go to this tree in a park, I believe, and these 3 girls would fall into a trance and have a vision of the Virgin Mary, who would then communicate things to them. Witnesses would not see the Virgin Mary, but they would see the 3 girls go into a trance, and they would hear what some described as a whining or a buzzing or a sound of a swarm of bees, and feel a little static electricity. They would talk about their hair standing up on their arms and backs of their necks and stuff. So there was some type of physical phenomenon occurring. So the girls would experience a woman. It would appear like a luminous woman who identified herself as a Virgin Mary, and other people would not experience that, but would experience this minor electromagnetic effect. So something was going on. And then sometimes the Virgin Mary would told one of the girls to like dip her face in a puddle. Like it was a puddle in the middle of the road, like in a city or in a town, and told her to like eat the mud at the bottom of this puddle. And it's like, yo, that poor girl. And she did it because the Virgin Mary told her to. And it's like, you know, the Catholic Church likes to ignore that part of the of this phenomenon. It did something else. Like it asked one of the girls to like scrape her fingers against a rough rock and like bloodied her knuckles up. Like, and the poor girls, they did it because they thought they were talking to like, you know, the Mother of God or whatever. And that's, you know, that's very bizarre that like the Virgin Mary or whatever this phenomenon is would ask little girls to do these things. It's like a playground bully. You know what I mean? And then it gave them really good prophecies about the future of Russia and the future of European civilization. It like predicted World War II and the liberal world order, and like it had 3 really accurate prophecies about future politics and culture. And at the same time was asking these girls to like hurt themselves with rocks and eat mud on a dirty city street. Like, it's extraordinarily strange. It's absurd, in fact, in the very definition of the term absurd. And researchers don't like to talk about this stuff. They'll pick and choose things. Like you'll get the religious side of it who will ignore the stuff about the eating mud and things like that. And they'll only talk about the nice, beautiful prophecies and the Virgin Mary, and they'll use it to bolster their belief. Then you get the people who will say like, oh, it never happened, or it's a type of schizophrenia. And, you know, nobody puts the whole thing together. They just pick and choose the parts that they like that will support whatever views they have. And there are very few researchers who are willing to like take a step back, look at the entire phenomenon, and try to just understand what it is, instead of trying to fit it into your theories or trying to fit it into your worldview. You have to look at it as a whole. And that's another aspect of liminality, is that and the trickster, how the trickster abuses or uses liminality is to confuse people purposefully with the same phenomenon. It's like, you know, scientists either don't want to talk about UFOs at all, or they'll say they're nuts and bolts physical craft with physical aliens from some other physical planet in the universe. And then you have the spiritualists who say like they're angels or they're interdimensionals or something. And, you know, the spiritualists will ignore the nuts and bolts part of it. The scientists will ignore the spiritual parts of it. And nobody looks at it as a whole. And it's like the 4 blind men and the elephant, which is an analogy that I like to use, is, you know, one blind man reaches out and he says, oh, it's a boa constrictor, you know, hanging out of a tree. And another blind man touches it and is like, oh, it's a big palm leaf fan. And then another one is further down, touches it, it's like, oh, it's the side of a barn. And then the 4th blind man touches it, it's like, oh, it's a tree trunk. Well, of course, the first guy was touching its trunk, the second guy was touching its ear, the third guy was touching its torso or its side, and then the 4th guy was touching its leg. They were all touching an elephant, but they all thought they were touching different things. This is, you know, this is our modern world. This is unfortunately the state of science, the state of religion, the state of spirituality, the state of philosophy, the state of art. Everybody thinks they know what they're examining and researching, but they don't. They touch a part of it and completely misidentify the entire phenomenon. And the trickster sits back and laughs his ass off at all of us. I mean, it's just something that tickles him pink, I guess. And to be able to synthesize the whole of the phenomenon is a challenge, because you have to essentially not have any beliefs. And you can't stick to any worldview. You have to be okay without knowing something. You either know something or you don't know something. And you have to be okay not knowing. You don't form a belief, because beliefs are nothing more than opinions. So when you live like that, when you live in that state of mind where I don't have any beliefs, I'm just looking for knowledge, and I'm fine without having knowledge in the meantime. When I find the real knowledge, sure, that'll be satisfying, but I'm also okay not having the knowledge. It's a rare state of mind. And this is, again, a liminal phase, because it's a liminal phase between ignorance and knowledge. So you can be either in ignorance completely, in a nice structure of ignorance, or you can be in knowledge completely or partially in a nice structure of knowledge. So to be between ignorance and knowledge is a liminal phase. Now, most people can't achieve knowledge. It's not something that modern humans can do. Knowing things is extremely difficult for modern people because our senses and our consciousness are not that well attuned, and people don't train in attuning and expanding their consciousness. So living in ignorance is quite easy, but nobody likes to do that. We all want to live in a stable structure of knowledge, but we can't do that. Well, most people can't. So to be in a stable structure that we like, we choose beliefs, and then we're happy with those, and that feels like a stable structure to us. It's like, I don't feel ignorant, I have this belief, and I feel like that's stable and stable knowledge. And so they do put themselves in a structure that then the trickster has less movement, because you're in a stable structure now. You're not in a liminal phase. But if you get rid of beliefs, now you accept being in a liminal phase essentially forever, or until you can live in a solid structure of knowledge. So again, that's extending a liminal phase. And now you are more open to paranormal phenomena, mystical experiences, and things like that, because you have essentially permanently placed yourself in a liminal phase where you can now interact with invisible things more often. And this is why in a culture of low complexity, a civilization of low complexity, like, say, a small commune or a tribe of hunter-gatherers, something, a simplistic type of culture, a simplistic type of civilization, shamans will have like a high social status. They'll be like the chieftains or whatever, or the leaders of the commune, or the leaders of the tribe will be these people who have liminality built into them, they talk to the spirits, they commune with the invisible, they have spiritual and philosophical knowledge. They'll have a lot of status in a low complexity society. In a high complexity society, one that has more structure, more institutions, shamans and mediums and spiritual people have extremely low status. It in fact gets completely inverted. And now the higher status people are very rigid in their thinking, very dogmatic in their thinking, whether they're priests in a religious institution that are extremely dogmatic, or whether they are scientists and academics who are extremely dogmatic in their worldviews, or politicians with their political science, and they're extremely dogmatic in how they think the world works. Those people have very high social status, and they're not liminal at all. They're like the opposite of liminal. So low complexity societies encourage liminality and appreciate it, and high complexity societies despise liminality and try to squash it and get rid of it. So in high complexity societies like ours, lots of technology, lots of institutions, academic institutions, political institutions, religious institutions, economic, and so on, there is very, very, very little room for liminality. If you want to have a liminal experience, it's essentially illegal. You can't just sit around and meditate all day, because you have to pay taxes, so you have to make money. You have to go to work to make money. So now you can't exist in a state of meditation all day because the government says, you have to pay me taxes. I'm the government, give me money. You can't just exist here. You can't just meditate all day. You can't just sit out in a field and eat shrooms if you want. You're going to make a horrible office worker. So liminal states of consciousness in our culture are essentially illegal. The nomadic lifestyle is essentially illegal. You're not allowed to be a vagabond. So the liminality of traveling is now illegal. You have to live in a sedentary, stable house, and you can't move around. So all the liminal things get pushed to the sides, get suppressed and pushed to the fringes. Anything that would allow for any type of liminality is essentially illegal and taboo and so on. And this this will force compensatory phenomena to occur, the compensation thing that Carl Jung liked to talk about, and Victor Turner to an extent in his Structure and Anti-Structure, that anti-structural forces of nature will reassert themselves. And you can see increased paranormal phenomena in times of superstructuralism, like when Sputnik was launched in '57 in the Soviet Union, and Americans felt really demoralized and down about it. They felt really sad and low, and that put them they were questioning the structures of their culture. They're like, oh my God, we lost the space race, which means our institutions aren't that great. I feel really low and a little depressed. I also feel a little at risk because our quote unquote enemy, the Soviet Union, who we like to believe was somehow our enemy, beat us at something, and now I feel at risk. And now they're in this liminal phase because the structures of their society kind of failed them. And in that window of superstructure that failed them, there was a ton of UFO phenomena, contact phenomena. The whole Valiant Thor dude who claimed to be an alien or whatever was talking to politicians back then. There was extreme contact and paranormal phenomena, poltergeists all over the country and things like that. Again, it happened again in '66 when Americans started having anti-American sentiment because of the Vietnam War. It was anti-government, anti-soldier, anti-everything American. And that really brought the morale of American culture down. And there was a ton of poltergeists and flying saucer activity in that year as well. And a lot of it was experienced by these counterculturalists. They were the ones who mostly saw the UFO phenomenon, although there were just regular, middle class and wealthy people, and more what we would call conservatives, who also experienced a lot of phenomena that year because of the low morale and the questioning of their social, political, and economic structures. So yeah, this brings that's one guy you could look into is another anthropologist named Max Weber. That's rationalization and revitalization. So when things are really rationalized, become rigid, freedom and the trickster and spirituality and psychic phenomena want to reassert itself and revitalize the human psyche. So when things become over-rationalized, a sort of psychic revitalization will occur. It's, again, the idea of compensation. To bolster this idea, you have, to give credit where credit's due, it was Martin Kottmeyer in one of his articles that he published in a journal. The article is called UFO Flaps. I can't remember what the journal was. Martin Kottmeyer was the guy who discovered the correlation between times of low national pride and increased paranormal phenomena that I was just mentioning. Another researcher, Carl Raschke, he wrote a book or a series of articles called UFOs, Ultraterrestrial Agents of Cultural Destruction. So I believe he got the term ultraterrestrial from John Keel. But what Carl Raschke was discussing in his works was that tricksters perform the service of cognitive deconstruction. So when your institutions become too rigid, you have too many dogmatic beliefs, the trickster comes in and shows you something that you cannot explain with your current set of beliefs, and will sort of just break you down in that way. So the term ultraterrestrial comes from John Keel. You probably know him from his book, The Mothman Prophecies. It was made into a movie. I think it was starring, was it Richard Gere? But yeah, he came up with a theory of the superspectrum, which is like a realm of reality that is higher and lower vibrational than what we perceive on the light spectrum. So, we can see the colors from red to violet. So ultraviolet and above is part of the superspectrum, and infrared and below is part of the superspectrum. Pretty much everything that's outside of the ability of humans to hear and see. We can hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz of sound. So anything below 20 hertz and above 20 kilohertz is also part of the superspectrum. Anything that's just beyond the range of human perception. And it's a populated place, apparently. Like, our range of the electromagnetic spectrum is populated by humans and animals and trees and microbes and insects, and all the stuff that we're surrounded by is in our range of the electromagnetic spectrum. And above and below our range is more of the cosmos, more beings, more life. And John Keel posits that the Trickster lives in this realm of the superspectrum, and it knows that we have a limited range of perception, and likes to play with that, like the way, like, what some children will go outside with a magnifying glass on a bright sunny day and like burn ants. That's kind of like what the Trickster does to us. The Trickster will kind of enter our reality and just play with us. A lot of the time, sometimes even harming. If you study some of the South American UFO phenomena, I mean, there's some scary stuff that happens there. There's a guy who was blasted with like a beam of radiation from a flying saucer, and within a few days, like, not to be graphic or to put a gross image in your head, but his flesh, his body decomposed very rapidly in a very visceral and pretty freaking gnarly way, and he died. This unfortunately is actually quite common in Brazil and Argentina. Well, it was common. I don't know how common it is these days. A lot of those UFO reports go underreported now. They were more likely to be reported in the 60s and 70s and don't get as reported anymore. But, the Trickster will use the forces of the superspectrum for and against people. And it's important to understand that this force of reality exists, and that it abides in this superspectrum, as John Keel calls it. I think it's a pretty solid theory. I think it's a bit limited. It's somewhat materialistic, because it only deals with electromagnetic phenomena, and it doesn't really get into the interdimensional side of things. It doesn't really get into the more spiritual or supranatural aspect of things. But it's a very good theory to start with. It's a good way of beginning to wrap your mind around it, is that there are realms above and below human perception that's of higher vibration and lower vibration than what a human can perceive, and that these realms are populated. That's a very important aspect of reality that we need to come to terms with. It's been taught in the traditions, in the traditional, the mystery schools, as people like to throw around the word mystery schools a lot these days. So I'll just throw it around too, because you know what I'm talking about. But it's a traditional teaching that there are realms above and below human perception. And the aspect of these invisible realms that loves to interact with humanity in very, very obvious and overt ways is the Trickster. The more like super evil things have a hard time breaking into our world. They need like ritual occultists to help them, to kind of open the door for them. So the more super evil lower stuff has a hard time interacting with us, but it does. And the higher spiritual, what we could call benevolent beings, have a more or less hands-off approach, or when they do interact with us, it's not super obvious. They're not going to show up in like a flying saucer that looks like they're some 1960s robot made out of rectangular boxes, walks out and like picks a flower and walks back into this weird looking George Adamski style flying hubcap. Those are bizarre experiences. That's not some higher being trying to teach us about aliens. It's obviously not an alien. A lot of these people were seeing stuff that looked like it was from a 1950s science fiction movie, and were led to believe that these are like actual aliens from other places. It's like, nah, this is some bizarre trickery that's occurring. These people are seeing something that's very bizarre, very childlike, and very absurd. So the more benevolent entities have a more subtle interaction with humanity. So the most obvious interactions with humanity, poltergeists and UFO phenomena and stuff, a lot of that is carried out by the Trickster, who has no problem doing wild, obvious things, because the Trickster has a childlike intelligence and just likes to mess around, I guess. So this understanding, these different levels of understanding, are part of the initiation of, like, a person will go through their lives. Most people never have a spiritual initiation. It's as the traditionalists would call it, it's for the elect. Now, that sounds elitist, and to an extent it is, but we have to be honest with ourselves, is that not everybody in a given generation is interested in higher knowledge. It's just a very, very, very tiny number of people. I would say less than 1%. Well, I would say less than 10% are interested in higher knowledge, and less than 1% actually do what's necessary to achieve higher knowledge. These are what are known as the elect. Not to get a big head about it, not to get egoic or arrogant about it. It's just a statistical fact. Most people are not interested in higher knowledge. It's just the way it is. And most people who are interested in higher knowledge are not interested in the hard work and the great, enormous effort necessary to actually achieve it. So the trickster can initiate someone in a very visceral and fast way. Again, it's all about the compensation. If you're repressing a part of yourself, it can come back out very quickly. So if you're born with a disposition towards spirituality and something in your life just doesn't let it happen, whether you live in like just crushing poverty and you don't have the time for spirituality, or you live in a social situation where you have a lot of peer pressure against spirituality, whatever the case may be, you have the disposition for it, but it's repressed in you, and you're not able to adopt a discipline or a practice that's going to improve your life, that's going to bring you to that spiritual place. The trickster might throw you a bone and give you a strange experience, but it's going to be visceral and abrupt and explosive. It will be like, because you can't slowly bring this out of you from childhood to adulthood, carefully practicing spirituality, learning, researching, practicing the spiritual disciplines, and you slowly let your spiritual flower unfold in a healthy, natural way, you've repressed that, so it's gonna just bust out of you one day, and one night you're gonna like think you got abducted by aliens or something. It's gonna be this intense and confusing experience, because you are compensating for something that you should have been doing for years. So you're going to have to get years of mind-bending knowledge in a very, very short period of time, sometimes a single experience or a small number of successive experiences. And so it's like a psychic compensation where the trickster like sees, oh, this person is not learning the spiritual or psychic things they're supposed to be learning. I'm just going to interact with them one night, like at 3:30 in the morning, the wolf's hour, the witching hour, and I'm just gonna snap them out of their preconceived notions about reality. They believe in materialism and modern science and stuff. Well, I'm gonna throw them into a very bizarre situation with very bizarre entities that they're not going to recognize. They're not going to know how any of this is happening. They're not going to be able to explain it with their current worldview, and it will instantaneously break them from that worldview. And people who have these experiences are now transformed immediately. Upon waking up the next morning, they are different people. They now... some of them, it goes in a negative way. I know a handful of abductees or contactees whose minds have been heavily damaged from the experience. This is a very small number of them who have a negative reaction to this kind of thing. They become afraid and paranoid and all that stuff. And that might happen, well, okay, the fear and paranoia happens to a lot of people who have it. But not getting through the fear and paranoia within a couple of years is what I'm talking about. People who stick with that fear and paranoia for years, and then they fall into, drug abuse, or they get prescribed drugs, and their lives are essentially ruined from the experience. But the people who are capable of getting through the fear and paranoia that's associated with one of these mind-bending compensation experiences are more creative, more intelligent, they are happier, they have a great deal more control over their emotions, they're better in social situations. They don't react as negatively to things anymore. They don't get annoyed as easily by people. They can see things more clearly. They have a better grasp of what their culture is like, what their culture is doing, how to interact with the world. They're just more, they're simultaneously more grounded and more intelligent, more spiritual, like at the same time, and they just become more well-rounded people. They had an initiatic experience that broke them out of the old mold, broke them of their old habits, their old worldview that was not serving them, and they were brought into the new, more spiritual and traditional view. And it was brought on by what people describe as alien abduction experiences, or a poltergeist, or a contact experience with Palladians, or something like that. And that is kind of like a psychic phenomenon wearing a bunch of different masks. You know, some people will see a vision of Jesus and be transformed one night that way. Some people will get visited by the tall, blonde Nordic aliens from the Pleiades. Some people will get needles stabbed in their abdomens or eyeballs from the little grays. But essentially the effect is by and large the same in the long term, maybe not in the short term. Some of those are more fear-inducing than others, and it depends on your disposition, it depends on your karma, it depends on a few things, what kind of compensation experience you'll have, how close to divinity it is, and how close to weird lower astral scary stuff it is, like little gray aliens doing crude medical experiments on you is a pretty low experience. But in the long run, it will eventually be positive if you can get through the liminal phase that it will force on you. Because now that you've had that experience, you can't go back to the way you saw the world before, not unless you're willing to do great psychic damage to yourself. If you want to like get rid of, you know, try and pretend like it didn't happen, try and pretend like you didn't experience it, you know, it's like putting a kink in a hose. It's not good. You can really like block yourself up energetically and burn yourself out, and like it's unnatural to repress yourself like that, especially after you've gained a higher degree of spiritual knowledge or a higher perception of the reality in which we live. To deny it and suppress it is going to cause things like depression, anxiety, and worse in some cases, as sad as it is. I know people who it was a fatal outcome, and so you get foisted into a liminal experience, because now if you do embrace it, which most people do because they have no choice, their worldview is just radically changed in a very short period of time. Now suddenly they feel like they can't relate to people around them. Their family, their friends don't know what the hell they're talking about alien abductions, they're talking about seeing the Buddha under a tree, they're talking about how Jesus showed up to them, they're talking about all this strange stuff and these strange experiences, and their friends and family are like, are you making this up? Are you looking for attention? Are you schizophrenic? Are you on drugs? Are you watching all those weird YouTube videos? Like, what are you doing right now? And now suddenly you can't relate to your friends and family anymore. There are some people who are fortunate enough to have very understanding friends and family, where if you do have an experience like that, they will understand, or they'll at least tolerate what you're talking about. They'll still accept you and love you and support you. But unfortunately, because we live in such a rigid, structural, materialistic society, most people don't have that type of support group, and they become estranged and distant from their friends and family, which again forces you into a liminal state, a prolonged liminal state. And now, because you're distant from your friends and family, you can't relate to people around you, you're between the world of humans and the world of whatever bizarre paranormal thing you experienced. And you will start to feel ungrounded because your friends and family, your earthly grounding support structure, has abandoned you, and you have abandoned it simultaneously. And so you have a risk of being pulled more into the paranormal side of things in an ungrounded way. And now you need to find a way to reground yourself. This is taking on a spiritual discipline, yoga, meditation. In America, I could recommend a good church group of non-judgmental people, some type of encounter support group. There are a lot of those. They don't really understand it. They like to push the aliens from other planets thing, so that's not going to help too much. What does help is that you're around people who have experienced the same thing, so focus on that. Focus on making friends, not so much on what you think happened to yourselves, because there's going to be all different people in these support groups. These people who think it's aliens, these people who think it was a spiritual thing, these people who think it was the military disguise, using hypnotic technology, making you think you're abducted by aliens. There's going to be all different kinds of conflicting views, and it starts arguments and debates, and that's not why you're there. You're there because you're with a bunch of people who have experienced the same thing. That's what you need to look at. That's the way it needs to be approached for your mental health, for your emotional health. That's more important than understanding what happened to you at first. You need to become stable again. You need to get yourself out of the liminal phase, because if you are in an artificially prolonged liminal phase, because it's been prolonged because your life kind of evaporated, your friends and family, your social structures kind of like evaporated away from you, that is an artificially prolonged liminal phase. That's not a good way of existing in a liminal phase. You have to find something that's going to ground you. Whether it's meditation, yoga, changing your diet, planting a garden, walking bare feet in the soil, or finding new friends that do support you. Just be careful. Be careful about these new friends. There's a lot of weird people out there. I'm just, from my own experience and from experience of people that I know in my life, these are the things that have helped us. Because you don't want to be in an artificially prolonged liminal phase and become subject to even more trickster activity. Because the initiation is just supposed to be an initiation. It's not supposed to last forever. You're not supposed to constantly be in an initiatory phase. There are other initiations to go through, but your first initiation should not be prolonged. You have one initiation that's over, your mind has changed, you exist in the world again, but with higher knowledge. You're stable again, no longer in a liminal phase. And a few weeks, few months, few years go by, and then like another initiation might occur where you're in a temporary liminal phase and you get to an even higher form of knowledge. But those ones, the later initiations are easier to handle because the first one's always the most difficult. The first one's like, going to the deep end of the pool and like, jumping off the high dive for the first time, But the second time you do it, it's easier. You know what I'm saying? So you have to be careful not to prolong any liminal phases that you're in unless you're doing so consciously and with a very specific goal in mind. If you want to consciously prolong liminal phases because it's what you're into, if you think it's going to help you for some reason, I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Just make sure you're fully aware of what you're doing. It's when you are artificially prolonging or a liminal phase, or when one is forced upon you that you don't want, you really need to protect yourself from how that opens you up to unseen influences, and you need to find a way to ground yourself emotionally, psychically, mentally, even physically, just to become stable. So find a place you can just breathe and like digest what just happened to you. But it's a very important thing, and like, if we lived in a healthy and traditional society, if you went through an initiation, a compensatory initiation like that, there would be groups out there to help you who would know exactly what happened. There'd be men like me who are like, okay, you can hang out with me for a few days, couple weeks, whatever you want. You can become my friend. Like, we know what's going on. We can guide you through this. I'm not trying to be arrogant, like, oh, I'm not your guru. I'm just saying there would be lots of people out there who would understand what you're going through and can relate. We might not have answers for you, but we'll be like, hey, look, we did this too. This is what happened to us. We had to go through this, and this. We had this kind of paranoia. We had this types of relationship issues, these types of financial issues, and this is how we got through it. In a healthy traditional society, we wouldn't even have to go through those social and financial issues because we would have institutions in our society, like the so-called mystery schools, that would be there as like an initiatory safety net for people going through these psychic transformations. And so those mystery schools, it's one reason why they don't last so long, is because those institutions are essentially liminal themselves, because they exist in that space between normal civilization, normal culture, and the bizarre, unseen, paranormal, and spiritual sides of things. And so it's like an institution that has placed itself in between these two worlds. And it's kind of like building a sandcastle on the beach. Like, a wave's going to come and wipe that thing out. You built it on the beach. That's a liminal space. You didn't build a stone castle on land. You built it you built a sandcastle on the beach and the water's just going to come and wipe it away. So those types of mystery schools and institutions, unfortunately, only last very short periods of time. Usually at the best peak of a culture, we'll have these institutions that can help spiritual seekers or people who experience liminal phases in their lives and are seeking a higher knowledge. Those institutions do come around in almost every civilization or every culture, but unfortunately for a very short period of time before some wave comes and brings it all crashing down, whether it's a political wave or a religious wave or a ideological wave or something. Unfortunately, those institutions don't last very long, and people who experience liminal stages of their lives are again on their own, unfortunately. So that's why I wanted to bring this up today. Because this channel is esoteric literacy. It's to understand, it's to become literate in these topics, to break them down to a very fundamental level that we can just gain an understanding of very basically how these things affect us. I don't want to talk about like high abstract things, like I'm not going to talk about star seeds or Pleiadians or like these things that a lot of New Agers like to talk about, but I want to talk about how these things and experiences affect you psychologically, how they affect your everyday life, and how to just remain healthy and sane. You can feel like you're not alone. You can feel like you're starting to grasp what's happening to you, and just know that like you get through it. These experiences are natural, and it's unfortunate that our culture has pushed these experiences and the experiencers off to the fringes, off to the margins, and then have allowed unhealthy liminality into our culture. The social and cultural movements that we see widespread today that are invading every institution, the media, the politics, the churches, and so on. You know what I'm talking about. Those movements that most of us are not very comfortable with. That's like the unhealthy kind of liminality that I addressed at the beginning. Unfortunately, these unhealthy forms of liminality are what get encouraged, and the healthy and spiritual forms of liminality get pushed to the margins. And I just find that to be dangerous. I think we need to form more support groups for each other, more communities where we communicate our experiences to each other, where we can create spaces for each other, where we can talk about these things, get to grips with them, maybe find some answers, maybe not, but the most important thing is, like, people who have experienced paranormal phenomena, whether it's UFOs, poltergeists, encounters, and so on, people are too focused on trying to find answers as to what they are, and then they leave the experiencers like away to the wayside, and it's like they don't care about how those people feel. That was my problem with researchers like J. Allen Hynek. Sorry to go off on another tangent, but real quick, UFOs, people experience a flying saucer experience or whatever, and then the researcher comes in and is like, oh, so tell me, what did it look like? How did this feel? What was that like? And then they just leave, and then the person is just left there like, well, I had this experience, and this guy didn't give a damn about me. He just wanted to know about, like, the flying saucer or the beings in it. He just asked me all these, like, clinical, scientific laboratory type questions, like the way a police investigator might ask, like a detective would ask about like something. And like this person is like, well, I'm emotionally damaged from this. Do you care about that? And it's like, no, I don't care. I'm leaving. Thanks for all the information. And then the experiencer is just left there like who is there anybody out there who cares how I feel? I just had this wild experience. I'm traumatized. My wife left me. I lost my job because my coworkers don't want me to talk about it. Like, my life's been destroyed by this, and nobody seems to give a damn. Well, I give a damn. I do. I truly do. So like, I won't pull a J. Allen Hynek on you. I'll listen to how you feel, how it's impacted your life. If you want to give me the specific details as to what you experienced, I would love to hear that too. But I also just want you to know that there are people who genuinely care more about you than about the phenomenon itself. And when I see people in artificially prolonged liminal phases of their lives, I like to offer myself to them as that grounding influence, because I know People need it. I needed it, and nobody gave it to me. I had to figure it out on my own. And thank God I did. But I just want to pay it forward. Like, I know how difficult it is when you have a strange experience, when you have a whole lifetime of strange experiences. Some of us are absolutely magnets for paranormal phenomena. And it vexes us, it torments us our whole lives. And nobody wants to hear it. Nobody wants to deal with you. Nobody cares. It's just so far out of their wheelhouse that they just don't know how to deal with you. And they don't care how you feel because they are too selfish, and they don't want, it's too weird for them. And they can't help you, and they don't want to help you. So, you know, I do. I care. I just want you guys to know that. So I'm gonna leave this at that. I know this was not a very structured video, but I hope it was useful to you. Thank you very much for watching, for getting through it all. I really appreciate your time. And I hope to see you again soon. And if you want, remember, check out my new channel, Key of Thought, which is a more discussion style way of you know, talking about these things, talking about culture, talking about music, if you're into that, a little bit more into politics and culture sometimes. And, you know, we tell jokes. It's a little more humorous. It's a little more lighthearted, I suppose. So Key of Thought over on YouTube and Rumble. But I will see you next time. Thank you very much for taking the time.